If you have made it to part 4, then you already know this story is not what it looked like at the beginning, and that is the truest thing that can be said about it. So let me take 2 minutes to bring you fully inside it before we go any further. Because what happens in part 4 requires you to understand every piece of what came before it. Welcome to Seoul of Africa. If this story moved you or left you wanting more, subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. We have so many more stories waiting for you, and every single one of them hits deeper than the last. A Korean mafia boss named Kang Jin-ho lost his wife 2 years ago and turned himself into a wall. His 7-year-old daughter Sora stopped talking, stopped eating properly, started telling her days to a worn stuffed bear because no one else in that enormous penthouse was listening. So Jin-ho built a process. 5 women, carefully selected, presented one at a time, his daughter invited to choose a mother the way he chose everything in his life, with criteria and structure and the belief that if you eliminated enough variables, you would eventually arrive at the right answer. Sora walked past all 5 of them. She walked to a woman named Amara Diallo who was standing at the sideboard with a water pitcher. 29 years old, Nigerian father, Korean mother, raised between 2 worlds and fully claimed by neither. She had come to Seoul 8 months earlier looking for her dead mother's family and had ended up cleaning the Kang penthouse instead, carrying a secret she could not figure out how to say, that the family portrait on the hallway wall showed the face of the aunt she had been searching for, that Park Soo-yeon, Jin-ho's dead wife, was the younger sister of Amara's mother, that by blood and loss and 36 years of a grief that had traveled between Lagos and Seoul without anyone knowing it was traveling, this household was already hers. She had already come home. She had just not known how to knock on the door. Sora had taken her hand at the dinner table and said, "I choose her." The retaliation came overnight, a fabricated immigration report, a termination letter, a labor tribunal motion, and beneath all of it, the discovery that 2 of the 5 women were connected to Jin-ho's most dangerous rival, director Shin Hyun-woo, who had used the dinner selection process as an intelligence operation. The woman who did the most damage, Bae Chae-rin, stood in her cold, pale apartment and made a decision that nobody saw coming. She withdrew every legal action. She severed her arrangement with Shin. She brought Jin-ho 4 years of documentation, names, contacts, placements that mapped exactly how deeply Shin's network had infiltrated the Kang organization. And in the hallway of the penthouse, 3 people sat on a marble floor that was never designed to be sat on. Jin-ho told Sora the truth about Amara. Sora listened to all of it, and then she said, "You were already ours, and you didn't know how to say it." She placed her small hand on top of Amara's hand. Not holding, just placing. The gesture of a child who understands that some things do not need words added to them. That night, Jin-ho stood in front of his wife's portrait for the first time in 2 years. He listened to Amara's lullaby from the kitchen. He heard his daughter laugh, the real laugh, the sudden one. And for the first time in 26 months, without an audience, without design, he smiled. That is where part 3 ended, in warmth. In the particular exhale of a household that has survived something and found itself on the other side of it with more than it started with. Part 4 does not begin in warmth. Part 4 begins with a phone call at 4 in the morning that changes everything. Fade to black. The city was still dark when it rang. Seoul at 4 in the morning is not the city it is at midnight. By 4, the last energy of the night has given out, and what remains is something quieter and more honest, the breathing of a city between identities, neither what it was, nor yet what it is becoming. Jin-ho was not asleep. He had not been sleeping well since the dinner. Not badly either. Not lying awake in the active way of a man in crisis, but lightly, in the shallow way of someone whose mind has decided that full unconsciousness is a luxury it cannot currently afford. He was at the window of his bedroom with a glass of water when the phone buzzed on the nightstand and he saw the name on the screen, and he was across the room before the second ring completed. The man on the other end was named Kwon Dae-ho. He was 56 years old, and he ran the logistics arm of the Kang organization, and he had been in that position for 11 years, and he called Jin-ho at 4 in the morning approximately twice a decade, which meant that every time he did, the reason was sufficient. "We have a problem," Kwon Dae-ho said. "Tell me." The shipping manifest for the Incheon facility was accessed 3 hours ago from inside by a login credential belonging to one of our senior administrators, a man named Lee Jun-seok, who has been with us for 7 years. The access is flagged because the manifest he pulled is not part of his operational responsibility. It covers the full inventory of our legitimate pharmaceutical distribution operation. Values, routes, contacts, client list. A pause. The credential was used from a location that is not the office. It was used from an IP address registered to a building in Mapogu. Jin-ho was very still. "Whose building?" "We are working on that, but Jin-ho, the documentation that Bai Chai-rin sent yesterday, the 4 years of Shin's network contacts. Lee Jun-seok's name is on page 17. He was placed in our logistics arm 14 months ago through a recruitment firm that Shin controls. The silence on the line was the kind that costs something to maintain. He knows we have the documentation, Jin-ho said, not a question. We believe so. If Chae-rin's withdrawal from the arrangement reached Shin before the documentation reached you, and the timing suggests it did, then he has had approximately 18 hours to activate whatever contingency he had in place for exposure. Another pause. The manifest access was the first move. We do not yet know what the second move is. Get Lee Jun-seok tonight quietly. I want him in the building before 6. Already moving. And find out who owns that building in Mapogu. I want a name, not a company, a person. The call ended. Jin-ho stood in the dark bedroom with the phone in his hand, and he looked at the city outside the window and he thought, 4 years. Shin had been building this for 4 years. Placements in the logistics arm, in the legal representation, in the supplier chain. The dinner was not the beginning of the operation, it was just the most audacious piece of it. An attempt to place an asset in the household itself, in the closest possible proximity to everything Jin-ho protected and decided and kept private. He had gotten lucky. His daughter had gotten lucky, though luck was not the right word for what Sora had done. Sora had not been lucky. Sora had been right. The distinction mattered. He got dressed. He did not go back to bed. Quick cut. 6:45 in the morning. The building's secure room, a space on the floor below the penthouse that had no windows and was known to approximately 8 people who worked for the Kang organization. Lee Jun-seok was 34 years old, and he had been recruited 14 months ago, and he had done his job competently and without apparent irregularity, and he had been on nobody's list of concerns until he appeared on page 17 of a document that a woman in deep red had spent 4 years quietly compiling in case she ever needed it. He sat in the secure room with his hands on the table and Kwon Dae-ho across from him and 2 other men standing at the wall, and he had the expression of a man who has been caught and knows it and is now performing the calculation of which direction surrender is most likely to go in his favor. Jin-ho came in. He sat down. Lee Jun-seok looked at him. Whatever calculation he had been running behind his eyes adjusted itself immediately in response to the face across the table. Jin-ho said, I know what you accessed and when and from where. I know who recruited you and I know what the arrangement was. I know that you have been reporting to someone in Shin's network for 14 months, and I know approximately what you have been reporting. He paused. What I need from you in the next 10 minutes is the name of your handler, not the recruitment firm, the person, the one you call when you have something. Lee Jun-seok was quiet. I want to be honest with you, Jin-ho said, in the tone he used when honesty was a tool and not a feeling. Your cooperation tonight determines the nature of your future considerably more than your silence does. You know who I am. You know how the organization handles betrayal. You also know that I have every piece of documentation Shin Hyun-woo's former associate compiled over 4 years, and that your name is already in it with enough detail to make your silence irrelevant to me. What I do not have is the name of the handler. That is what you have, and right now it is the only thing you have that I want." Lee Jun-seok looked at the table. Then he looked at Jin-ho. Then he said a name. Jin-ho looked at Kwon Dae-ho. Kwon Dae-ho pulled out a phone. Jin-ho stood. He walked to the door. Then without turning around he said, "Make sure he is comfortable. He is going to be here for a while." He left. The name Lee Jun-seok had given him was not a name Jin-ho knew, but it was a name that connected through 3 intermediate contacts in the documentation Che-ren had provided to a man who ran the Eastern distribution network of the Shin organization. A man named Director Shin Hyun-woo, considered the most reliable piece of his infrastructure, not a foot soldier, not a mid-level operator, the person Shin trusted most with the movements that mattered. This changed what Jin-ho could do. Slow zoom on the closed door of the secure room. The hallway outside it empty and fluorescent lit and unremarkable. The kind of corridor that exists in every building and that nobody notices, and that holds in this building on this morning the first piece of leverage Jin-ho needs to end a 4-year war before it becomes a longer one. Upstairs, the penthouse was waking up. The kitchen staff arrived at 7. Mrs. Cho began her morning rounds at 7:15. And at 7:30, Amara appeared from the staff corridor in her uniform with her hair in its bun, and she went to the kitchen and she put the kettle on, and she hummed something low and without thinking about it, the way she always did, the way her body did it for her, while her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the hallway floor, about Sora's hand placed on hers with the deliberate lightness of a child making a point, about Jin-ho's face when he said, "We." The single syllable that had reorganized something she had been carrying for 8 months into a shape she did not yet have a name for. She was also thinking about the photograph on her desk, the worn framed photograph of her mother and the aunt she had never met, the 2 women whose story she had been carrying since she was old enough to carry it. She had placed it on the desk 3 days ago when she was unpacking the bag that she had nearly not unpacked, and she had not moved it since. She had looked at it every morning when she woke up, and she had felt, each time, the specific quality of something that has finally arrived after a very long journey. The stillness of a thing that has stopped traveling. She did not know, as she stood in the kitchen with the kettle beginning to warm, that 45 feet below her and 3 floors down, a man was sitting in a room with no windows, having given up the name that would change the balance of the next several weeks of her life. She did not know about the 4 in the morning phone call. She did not know about the manifest access or Lee Jun-seok or the handler whose name was now in Jin-ho's possession. What she knew was that the kettle was almost boiling and that in about 3 minutes Sora would appear in the kitchen doorway in her school uniform with her hair and her braids and her specific morning expression. Serious and quiet until the first person made her laugh, and then entirely different, and that this was the part of the day she had somehow, without noting the moment it began, started to organize herself around. The kettle boiled. She poured. 3 minutes later, exactly as predicted, small footsteps in the hallway, the kitchen doorway, Sora, bare, braids, the serious morning face. "Good morning," Amara said. "Good morning," Sora said. She climbed onto her stool at the counter, and she placed her bear facing forward on the counter surface so he could see what was happening, and she looked at Amara and she said, "Appa didn't sleep." Amara looked at her. "How do you know?" "His light was on at 3 and at 5, and when I passed his study this morning, his coffee cup was in the wrong place. He moves it to the left when he has been awake a long time. It is usually on the right." Amara absorbed this. "He has some things he is dealing with," she said carefully. "About the bad men," Sora said. Not a question. The flat statement of a child who has grown up in the specific atmosphere of a household where certain things are known but not discussed, and who has long since stopped pretending she does not know them. "Yes," Amara said, "about the bad men." Sora considered this for a moment. Then she said, "Is it dangerous for this house?" Amara looked at this 7-year-old child on her kitchen stool, asking about danger with the calm directness of someone who has decided that being afraid of the answer is less useful than having it. She thought about what to say. She thought about what Jin-ho would say if he were here. She thought about what the truth was. "Your father is very good at what he does," she said, "and right now he is doing it. That is all you need to know." Sora looked at her for a moment, the checking look, the internal calibration against something private. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, and she picked up her bear and she waited for breakfast and she did not ask again. And Amara stood at the counter and she thought, "She trusts me to tell her the truth in the right amount. She trusts me to know the right amount." The weight of that trust was something she was still learning to carry without flinching. Quick cut. Jin-ho's study. Mid-morning. The meeting with director Shin Hyun-woo had been arranged through a back channel that Jin-ho's organization used for communications that needed no record. The location was Jin-ho's choice, a private dining room at a restaurant in Gangnam that the owner maintained for clients who valued discretion more than the menu. Neutral in the sense that neither organization claimed it. Not neutral in the sense that Jin-ho had used it a dozen times and Shin had never been inside it. Territorial advantage was always a choice, even when it looked like hospitality. Shin arrived at noon exactly. He was 58 years old, and he had the appearance of a man who had spent his career being underestimated, soft in the face, unremarkable in his clothing, the kind of person who moves through a room without the room rearranging itself for him. That was, Jin-ho had long known, the most dangerous quality a man in their industry could possess. The ones who arrived with presents had already told you everything about them. The ones who arrived like furniture were still withholding. They sat across a table from each other, no staff present, no phones visible. Two men who had operated in the same city for 15 years and had conducted their war through intermediaries and infrastructure and the patient accumulation of position, and who were now, for the first time, in the same room. Shin poured tea. He did not ask if Jin-ho wanted any. He simply poured 2 cups. The gesture of a man who was not going to perform nervousness because he had decided correctly that performing nervousness would be its own kind of weakness. "I appreciate the invitation," Shin said. "I have something of yours," Jin-ho said. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. Not the full documentation. Not the 4 years of compiled intelligence that Chaerin had sent. Just 1 page. The page that had Lee Jun-sok's handler's name on it with 3 cross-reference connections that made the relationship unmistakable. Shin looked at the paper. He looked at it for a long time. His expression did not change, but his hand, which had been reaching for his teacup, stopped mid-movement and returned to the table. That was enough. "What do you want?" Shin said. "A conversation," Jin-ho said, "about the nature of our arrangement going forward." "We don't have an arrangement." "We are going to," Shin looked at him. "You are going to threaten me with documentation that one of my former associates compiled against me. I am going to tell you that the documentation is incomplete and that you have misread its implications. We are going to spend an hour discussing leverage and then reach an agreement that satisfies neither of us and holds for approximately 18 months before something disrupts it." He picked up his tea. "That is how this conversation goes. You know that. I know that. Can we skip to the relevant part?" Jin-ho looked at him. "The relevant part," he said, "is that you placed 2 people at my dinner table. One of them is now working with me. The other one is sitting in a room in my building with a name in his mouth that connects your most trusted operations manager to an access breach in my logistics arm that happened 48 hours after your former associate withdrew from your network." He paused. "The conversation I want to have is not about 18 months. It is about what happens in the next 72 hours, because in 72 hours I am going to hand everything I have, the documentation, the handler's name, the full trace on the logistics breach, and everything Park Sung-min has assembled in the past week, to the relevant authorities. unless this conversation gives me a reason not to. Shin was quiet. The restaurant was quiet. Somewhere outside, Seoul moved at its regular pace. What reason? Shin said. Full withdrawal. Every placement in my organization, logistics, legal, supplier chain, the two in the legitimate businesses, I want them all gone within 30 days, quietly, with explanations that create no questions. I want the recruitment firm dissolved. I want no further contact with any member of my household, my staff, or anyone connected to me. Jin-ho picked up his own tea. In exchange, the documentation stays where it is. Lee Jun-seok is returned to his life, which I suggest he uses to find a different line of work. And we go back to the arrangement that has served both of us adequately for 15 years, operating in the same city without operating against each other. Shin looked at the paper on the table between them. He looked at Jin-ho. He was doing, Jin-ho could see, the same calculation that Lee Jun-seok had done in the secure room that morning. The assessment of what he had, what he was being offered, and which direction surrender moved in his favor. The difference between Lee Jun-seok and Shin Hyun-woo was that Shin was better at not showing the calculation while it ran. The dinner, Shin said finally, the selection process, that was an overreach. Yes, Jin-ho said. It was suggested to me as a low-risk position, a passive arrangement that required no active interference. Someone's daughter made it not passive, Jin-ho said, and something in his voice when he said someone's daughter was different from everything else he had said in the room, quieter, with a quality that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it. The quality of a man saying the name of something that matters. Shin heard it. He was a careful man. He heard everything. Your daughter, Shin said. Yes. Shin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and this surprised Jin-ho, which almost nothing did. I heard she made a remarkable choice. Jin-ho looked at him. I have sources in many places, Shin said. The story of what happened at that dinner table moved through several channels before it reached me. What I heard was that a child looked past everything that was being offered and chose correctly. He paused. I have a daughter. She is 23. She moved to Vancouver 3 years ago, and I have not spoken to her since because of choices I made in the years before she left. He looked at the paper on the table. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I am not going to negotiate with a man whose 7-year-old daughter made a better decision than I have made in 30 years of this industry. He picked up the paper. He folded it. He placed it in his pocket. 30 days, all of them, and we go back to 15 years. He stood. He looked at Jin-ho. The woman your daughter chose, he said. I hope she stays. He left. Jin-ho sat at the table alone for a moment. The restaurant was still quiet. His tea had gone slightly cold. He looked at the table where the paper had been, and he thought about what Shin had said about his daughter in Vancouver and the 23 years that preceded her leaving, and he thought about how much a person has to give away to build the kind of power that makes everything except the things that matter possible. He thought about his own daughter in her school uniform on a kitchen stool this morning, placing her bear carefully on the counter so he could see, asking about danger with the directness of a child who has decided that the truth in any amount is better than a comfortable approximation of it. He left a generous tip and he went back to his building and he told Park Sung-min to prepare the withdrawal documentation, and he called Kwon Dae-ho and he said, "Let Jun-seok go." And then he sat in his study for a long time doing nothing, which was something he was getting incrementally better at. Slow zoom on the empty chair across his desk, the 2 teacups, the table in a restaurant that holds conversations without record and forgets them when the clients leave. Fade to black. That evening, the penthouse felt different from every evening that had preceded it in the past week. The specific tension of a household under external threat had not disappeared exactly. These things do not disappear, they redistribute, but it had changed its quality. It was no longer pressing from outside. It had settled into something internal. Something that had to do not with what was being done to the household from without, but with what was happening inside it that nobody had yet found language for. Amara had made dinner, not because it was her responsibility. The kitchen staff handled dinner. But because Mrs. Cho had mentioned that the kitchen staff's evening person had called in sick, and Amara had said, before thinking about whether she was overstepping, "I can do it." And Mrs. Cho had looked at her with the expression she wore when she was reassessing something and had said, carefully, "Yes, all right." And Amara had cooked. She had made jollof rice, the Nigerian version, her father's version, the version her mother had learned to love in a Lagos kitchen in 1993 and had made every Friday for the rest of her life as a kind of weekly declaration that the two of them had built something real from the distance between their worlds. Amara made it the way her father had taught her, the tomatoes cooked down low, the stock added in stages, the rice allowed to catch just slightly at the bottom of the pot, which was not burning, it was the point. It was where the flavor lived. Sora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30 and smelled it and said, "What is that?" "Jollof rice," Amara said. "What is jollof rice?" "Something my father made, something my mother learned to love." She paused. "Something I want you to try." Sora looked at the pot. She looked at Amara. "Is it spicy?" "A little." "How much is a little?" "Less than frightening. More than nothing." Sora considered this metric seriously. Then she climbed onto her stool and she watched Amara finish it, and she asked questions the whole time. Why does it go in that order? Why does it need to catch at the bottom? What is that spice called? Where does that spice come from? The questions of a genuinely curious person who has decided that the person in front of them knows things worth knowing. Amara answered all of them. When Jin-ho came upstairs from his study, later than his usual time, carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent a day doing things that needed to be done and is relieved they are done but cannot yet feel the relief because the body is still running the adrenaline of the having done it, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at his daughter on her stool. He looked at Amara at the stove. He looked at the steam rising from the pot, and he smelled something that was not the food that was usually made in this kitchen, something richer and more complicated, something that had traveled a very long distance and arrived on his stove and was filling his penthouse with a warmth that the architecture had been designed to prevent. Sora looked up and saw him in the doorway. "Appa, Amara made jollof rice. Her father taught her. It catches at the bottom on purpose, and it is not an accident, even though it sounds like an accident." Jin-ho looked at Amara. Amara looked at him. Something in her expression asked without asking, "Is this all right? Is this too much?" Does a woman who cleans your house have the right to fill it with her father's recipe and her mother's Friday ritual? He said, "It smells like something my wife would have wanted in this kitchen." The sentence surprised him as much as it surprised anyone. It came from somewhere below planning, below management, from the same place the smile had come from the night before in the empty hallway. The place that had been closed for 2 years and was opening not all at once, not dramatically, but in the way of a window in a room that has been sealed too long, unevenly, with resistance, letting in the air in increments. Amara looked at the pot. Then she looked at him. "Then sit down," she said. "Both of you." They sat. They ate jollof rice at the kitchen counter, not the formal dining room, not the long table where 5 women had performed and a child had walked away from all of them. The kitchen counter where the lighting was warmer and the stools were lower and there was not a crystal glass or a white linen in sight. Mrs. Cho appeared in the doorway at some point, assessed the situation, and retreated without comment. The staff bathroom light was off. The building was quiet around them. Sora ate with the focused attention she gave everything that was worth her focus. Halfway through, she said, "It is spicy." And then she kept eating. Which was, Amara had learned, Sora's highest form of endorsement. Jin-ho ate in silence for a while. Then he said, "My wife used to make kimchi fried rice on Friday nights after Sora was born. She said it was the one thing she could make that tasted like her grandmother. He paused. I have not had it since she died. I told myself I was not hungry for it. I think I was afraid it would taste wrong without her making it. The kitchen was very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not absence of sound, but presence of something that is being said in the space between the words. Amara said, "My mother made jollof rice every Friday for the same reason. She said it was the thing that tasted most like my father even when he was in the room, because she had made it for him first, before she knew how to make anything else that was his." Jinho looked at her. She learned it after she married him. She learned it before, Amara said, when she decided she was going to marry him but hadn't told him yet. She learned it so that when she said yes, she would already know something of his world. She wanted to arrive with something rather than empty-handed. Jinho held her gaze for a moment. There was something in that story that was doing something to the air in the room, not because of what it meant about Amara's mother, but because of what it sounded like. The specific quality of a person who enters a new world and prepares themselves for it before they are invited in. The specific quality of someone who arrives with something rather than empty-handed. He looked at his bowl. Then he looked at Sora, who was still eating and observing everything through lowered eyelashes with the practiced subtlety of a child who has learned that the most interesting things happen when adults forget they are being watched. "Sora ya," he said. "Yes, Appa. What do you think of jollof rice?" Sora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think it is brave," she said. Amara looked at her. "Brave?" "It tastes like it decided to be itself," Sora said. "Even the spicy part, even the bottom part. Everything in it decided to stay what it was, even when it could have been less." The kitchen was silent for a moment. Then Amara made a sound that was half laugh and entirely genuine, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, and she looked at this 7-year-old child who had just described a pot of rice with the precision of a poet, and she thought, "Your mother would have adored you. Every day of your life she would have adored you." Jinho was looking at Sora with an expression that Amara had not yet seen on him. Not the stone face, not the cracked open face of the hallway, but something quieter than both of those. Something that was simply love, unmixed with grief for once, not shadowed by loss or complicated by guilt. Just a father looking at his daughter and finding her remarkable. He said, "You sound like your Iyama." Sora looked up at him, her large, dark eyes very still. "Is that okay?" she asked. "It is the best thing," he said. "It is the very best thing." Sora looked at her bowl, then at the bear sitting on the counter beside her, then at Amara. She would have liked the jollof rice, she said. Iyama. She liked things that were brave. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Amara stood and she cleared the bowls and she put the kettle on and she said, "Who wants barley tea?" And the kitchen breathed again, the normal rhythm of it returning, the evening settling back into its shape around the three of them. Quick cut. Later. The hallway. Jinho and Amara. It was late. Sora was in bed. The kitchen was clean. The penthouse had gone fully quiet. The quality of quiet that belongs only to very large spaces when the people inside them have stopped moving. A quiet that is almost architectural. The building asserting itself now that the humans have conceded the floor. Amara was on her way back to the staff corridor. Jinho was on his way to his study. They met in the hallway near the portrait in the specific way of two people in a shared space who have been moving around each other carefully for weeks and have, on this occasion, arrived at the same point at the same time without managing to avoid it. They stopped. The portrait was between them and above them both. Su Yan looking out. Jinho said, "Thank you for dinner." "You don't have to thank me for dinner." "I am thanking you anyway." She looked at him. In the hallway light, the recessed evening setting, the warmest it ever got, she looked at the sharp, angular face that had been giving nothing away for so many months and was giving, tonight, just slightly more than nothing, the particular almost expression of a man who is standing at the edge of something and has not yet decided to step. She said, "How did it go today? The things you were handling?" He looked at her. The question was direct. He had not expected it to be direct, not because she wasn't direct, she was always direct, but because this particular directness was asking about a part of his life that nobody in his household asked about because they knew better than to ask, or thought they did. Better than it could have, he said. The immediate threat is managed. The longer problem is managed for now. There will be other problems. There always are. But tonight, the household is safe. She nodded. She looked at the portrait briefly, then at him. She is why you do it, she said. Sora, all of it, the organization, the decisions, all the things that go with it that I will not pretend I don't understand, are not comfortable. Yes, he said. She is worth it, Amara said. In case you ever wonder whether it is worth it, she is extraordinary, Jinho. What she said tonight about the rice, she sees things. She has always seen things. You know that. But sometimes I think you don't know how rare it is, what she sees, how she sees it. She paused. Your wife gave her that. Jinho was quiet. The hallway was quiet. The city was somewhere below them, not relevant to what was happening in this corridor between these two people who had been orbiting something for weeks without landing. He said, she gave her that. And I think you are going to give her something else, something I have not been able to give her. He paused. The words cost him more than he had calculated. She deserves both of those things. She deserves everything both of those things add up to. Amara looked at him. She was very still. I am not good at this, he said. At the things that happen outside of strategy and control and the management of outcomes. I spent 15 years in this industry because it gave me a world that had rules I understood and positions I could take and threats I could identify and neutralize. The other world, the world where things happen that cannot be neutralized, I have always been worse at that. He paused again. The pause of a man choosing his next words with the same care he would use in a room full of dangerous people, because this room, this corridor, this conversation felt to him like the most dangerous one he had been in all day. I want to say something. I am not sure I know how to say it correctly, Amara said. Then say it incorrectly. He looked at her, and then he said it, not perfectly. Not with the smoothness of a man who has rehearsed it or the confidence of a man who does this easily, with the specific awkwardness of a person saying a true thing in a language they have not used in a very long time and are afraid they have forgotten. He said, I am grateful that you stayed. I am grateful that Sora found you. I am grateful that the door that was supposed to be closed was not closed. He paused. And I am aware that gratitude is not the only thing I am feeling when I say those words. And I thought you should know that, in case it is relevant, in case it is something you are also aware of and have been not saying for similar reasons. The hallway held both of them inside it, the portrait above them, the city below, the distance between them, 3 feet of marble floor that was both nothing and everything depending on what came next. Amara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the face that had been closed to her for months and was open now in the most expensive way a closed face can open. Not fully, not all at once, but enough, cracked enough to see what was behind it. She said, I have been aware of it since the morning you sat on your daughter's floor. She paused. And I have been not saying it because you are my employer, and because I have been here for 3 months. And because everything about my situation in this household is already more complicated than it was supposed to be. And because, she stopped. Because, he said. Because I am afraid, she said. Not of you. Of what it means to want something in a place where I have already been told I don't belong. I have spent my whole life wanting things in places that found reasons to tell me I didn't belong. And I am very tired of wanting things that cost me the leaving. She looked at the portrait. Your wife found her way to you through a family that did not think she was making the right choice. My mother found her way to my father through a family that removed her from the register. The women in this story, your wife, My mother. They were brave about the wanting. Her eyes came back to him. I am trying to learn that from them. Jin-ho looked at her. He looked at her for the length of a full breath. And then he did something that was not strategic and not managed and not part of any framework he had ever built. He reached out and he placed his hand over hers where it rested at her side. Not holding, not pressing, just placing. The same gesture his daughter had made on the hallway floor a week ago, learned or inherited or arrived at through some instinct that ran in the family. A light, deliberate weight. He said, "Then we will be brave together, slowly, in the right amount." He paused. "That is all I am proposing right now. The right amount, slowly. Is that something you can say yes to?" She looked at his hand over hers. She looked at his face. She said, "Yes." Slow zoom on the hallway, the portrait above. The two hands the same configuration as Sora's gesture on the marble floor, recreated now in a different register between different people and meaning something larger but built from the same material, the same decision to place rather than grip, to offer a weight rather than a demand, to let the other person feel that they are not alone in the carrying without requiring them to go further than they are ready to go. The portrait looked on. Su-yan's warm eyes, the face that had always seen things before everyone else in the room, fade to black. What happened in the days after that conversation was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It moved the way the truest things in a household move, slowly through the accumulation of small moments that do not individually mean much and that mean everything in total. Jin-ho started appearing in the kitchen for breakfast rather than taking coffee alone in his study. Amara stopped moving to the other side of the room when he entered it. Sora watched both of them with the expression of a person watching a proof being completed that they already knew the answer to. The specific satisfaction of being right about something that mattered. Uncle Tae-sung, who noticed everything and said only what was necessary, said nothing. He simply stopped worrying about Jin-ho's study light being on at 4 in the morning, because it stopped being on at 4 in the morning. And that, to a man who had been watching Jin-ho survive for 2 years by not sleeping, was sufficient information. Mrs. Cho took approximately 2 weeks longer to adjust. She was not opposed. She was simply someone for whom adjustment happened in stages, and who expressed each stage not in words but in degrees of the way she poured tea. By the 3rd week, the tea was being poured in a way that had relaxed by a perceptible margin. That was how Amara knew they had turned a corner. The Shin withdrawal proceeded over 30 days. Placements were removed. The recruitment firm began its quiet dissolution. Lee Jun-seok, true to his word, found a different line of work. Specifically, he moved back to his hometown in Gyeonggi-do and opened a small restaurant, which was the most unexpected outcome of everything that had begun with a dinner table and a child's choice. The logistics arm was re-secured. Park Sung-min compiled a final report and delivered it, and then went back to being the person who brought information when it was needed and otherwise was not there, which was the particular skill set his role required. The threat did not disappear, it redistributed, a different configuration of the same pressures that had always existed in the world Jin-ho moved through. But the household was no longer the target, and the household increasingly was no longer just a household. It was becoming something else, something that had a morning routine built around jollof rice and barley tea and a 7-year-old's questions about spices and stock and the right amount of bottom catching. Something that had a lullaby in it and footsteps finding the lullaby and the laugh that followed. Something that had, in its long marble hallway near a portrait that had stopped being walked past and started being stopped in front of, 2 people figuring out, slowly and in the right amount, what they were brave enough to build, and at the center of all of it, small, straight-backed, braids slightly undone by mid-afternoon, bare under one arm, the large, dark eyes of a child who had walked across a dining room 6 weeks ago and taken the hand of the right person without anyone telling her what to look for. She knew what she had done. She had always known. She had just been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Quick cut. One ordinary afternoon. The living room. Sora was drawing at the coffee table. Amara was on the sofa reading a Korean novel that Tae-sung had recommended and that she was finding difficult in the best way, the kind of difficult that stretched. The room was quiet in the way it was quiet now. Not the cold, institutional quiet of the first weeks, but the warm quiet of a space where people are comfortable being in the same room without talking. Sora looked up from her drawing. She looked at Amara. She said, "What do I call you?" Amara looked up from the book. "I mean," Sora said, with the precision of a child who has been thinking about a question for a while and is now delivering the full version of it, "I know what you are. We know the family part, and I know Appa is figuring out his part, and I know you are figuring out your part. But what do I call you right now while everyone is figuring everything out?" Amara looked at her. She set the book down. She thought about it seriously because Sora's questions deserved serious thought. "What do you want to call me?" she asked. Sora thought. "I want to call you something that is true," she said. "I don't want to call you something that is not true yet just because I want it to be true. But I don't want to call you the maid because that is technically true, but it is not the truest true." Amara almost smiled. She pressed it down. The question deserved an answer, not a smile. "Then call me Amara," she said. "That is always true. And when you find the word that is the truest true, you will know it, and you can use it then." Sora looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, satisfied. She looked back at her drawing. Amara looked at what Sora was drawing. It was the hallway. The marble floor, the portrait on the wall, 3 small figures sitting cross-legged at the base of it, recognizable in the specific way that a child's drawing is recognizable, not detailed, not technically accomplished, but absolutely true. The 3 figures, the portrait above, the small child hand placed on the woman's hand, drawn in careful, deliberate detail despite everything else being simple. The most important thing given the most space. Under the drawing, in Sora's large, careful handwriting, she had written a title. It said, "The Day We Found Each Other." Not the day Amara found them. Not the day Sora chose her. The day we found each other. The communal, the mutual, the thing that happened to all of them at the same time from different directions. Amara looked at it for a long time. She looked at the drawing and she thought about her mother's photograph on the desk in the small room at the back of the penthouse. She thought about the lullaby that had traveled from Lagos to Seoul inside a woman who didn't know where it was taking her. She thought about a portrait in a hallway and the specific quality of a face she had been looking at on a bedside table her whole life. She thought about Sora at the dinner table, about a small hand reaching up and the world rearranging itself around the choice. She thought about the hallway last night, a hand placed over hers. A voice asking if slowly and in the right amount was something she could say yes to. She said yes, she thought. I said yes, I said. And it is the truest thing I have said in 8 months in this city. Slow zoom on the drawing on the coffee table. The 3 figures at the base of the portrait, the hand on the hand, the title in careful child's writing, "The Day We Found Each Other." This is not the ending. There are things still unresolved in this story. Things that take longer than 6 weeks to resolve. Things that cannot be settled in a hallway with a hand placed carefully over another hand. Things that require time and the accumulation of ordinary days and the slow work of 2 people learning each other properly rather than all at once. There are conversations Jinho and Amara have not yet had. There are mornings that will be difficult and evenings that will require more than barley tea and a pot of jollof rice to navigate. There are the ongoing pressures of a world that does not pause because a household has found its footing. There is the question of what Sora calls her when the truest true word arrives. There is the question of what this family is called, officially, eventually, when the figuring out is done. Part 5 is the last part of this story, and it is the part where all of those questions get answered, not quickly, not cleanly, but honestly, the way this story has always moved, through the honest thing rather than the comfortable one, through the small true moment rather than the large performed one. Part 5 is where the three figures sitting on the marble floor in a child's drawing become something the building was never designed to hold and somehow holds anyway. Subscribe right now. Turn on the notification. Part 5 is the ending this story has been building towards since a little girl heard a lullaby through a cracked door and opened it and said, "You have a nice voice." She was right about that too. She was right about everything. Stay with us for one more part. It will be worth it. This story has earned that much from you, and it has so much more left to give.